Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 23rd of March 2023, which makes this a 7-day mapping update. I don't think it's ever been this long since I've done a mapping update, and you will therefore expect to see quite a lot of pins on the map, and quite a lot of pins of both colours, particularly you can imagine with the Russians as they grind on in many places, but the Ukrainians trying to push back in a couple of places. I'm going to start up in the north around Kursk to see what we generally expect to see. That is the closing net of control around the Ukrainian sectors. I say sectors because one of them has been bisected, or that the entire Kursk area has been bisected. The Russians seem to be pushing down into Ukraine as well in an area around Novankiv. At least that's according to the mapper Syriac maps, but also Andriy Perpetua agreeing that to some extent the Ukrainians have been pushed back south of the border. So we'll have to watch out for that one. The Russians squeezing the Ukrainians back into these two sectors there, and then getting pretty much to the border in the middle. That is unsurprising, and that continues. But we also have this attack, or these attacks you could say, into Belgorod. And goodness me, what is going on there? Well, it's been quite hard to get decent information out of there. We have seen some Ukrainian vehicles get taken out by Russian drones. This is not nearly as wide scale an invasion or incursion as we saw up in Kursk, and it seems that the Ukrainians are going to struggle to make any serious inroads into this area, I think. And it makes you wonder, what exactly is going on. We know, well, it's obviously very close to the Kursk attack. The Kursk areas have a lot more area under the Ukrainian control still there. And is it worth, piling troops into there? But then it becomes very attritional as the Russians have huge numbers of resources, personnel thrown at the Ukrainians in that sector. Or is it cleverer to hit elsewhere, or to put these troops somewhere along the front line where there is already existing fighting going on? And they decided to go across the border into Belgorod to try and, I presume, get some kind of token to bargain with as negotiations are impending, or at least taking place as we speak to some degree. We have Demidovka, this village up here that some are claiming is being fought over. As you can see, there's a quite big difference here between Syriac maps and Andriy Perpetua's mapping. Sorry that there are all these lines over. Syriac maps is kind of it's a bit weird in this area. They put an overlay of another colour over the existing mapping that they have. It's all a bit weird. Anyway, aside from that, we can see that Andriy Perpetua has the Ukrainian defense, or the Russian defensive line, pushed back to Demidovka, suggesting that there's quite a lot of grey zone around there, and that there's a grey zone around this town or this village of Prileseye. There are some claiming that is actually under control of the Ukrainians now, and in fact, Andriy Perpetua had that as a something of a grey zone. So there's a movement there and a movement up here, and I think there's fighting on the way toward Hrafivka, to the point where it looks a little bit like, so initially, this is what we saw. We had the Russian Kursk area up here being the site of Ukrainian fighting, and then down here along the border going into Belgorod in these three places: Hrafivka, Demidovka, and Prileseye. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation. You can see that is what some people are interpreting things as looking like. Reported that Zelensky's office has confirmed there's now a military operation. So this was March 19th. In fact, it was going on prior to that. So it's like a week old now. And given that it's a week old, it's interesting that actually there's not a huge amount of difference in land taken, which I think indicates it probably is pretty tough for the Ukrainians to take much land here. There are claims that and I reported this morning from Russian sources, that potentially maybe 1,000 Russian troops are in danger of being encircled in this area, possibly in the Demodovka area. And that could be serious for the Russians. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. I'm interested to see how much effort the Ukrainians put into this area, how many personnel, how many people, how many pieces of material they throw at Belgorod, given all the challenges they have elsewhere. I can see arguments for and against it, of course, and we'll have to see how that develops. I don't know that I've got, nothing more particularly in my sources talking about there. It is because I think it's ongoing, and it is obviously, something that the Ukrainians are going to be keeping a tight lid on in terms of operational security. I don't think, I'm not surprised that there's not a lot of information coming out from there, to be perfectly frank. Just seeing if there's anything on my sources concerning mapping from that area. No, there's more stuff to do with Nadia and stuff that we're coming to in a wee while. Okay, so moving on to we're going to bypass Vovchansk rather quickly. Some small gains in Vovchansk, interestingly, according to Surat maps, but not according to anyone else. I think it's quite stable there, to be fair. Now, up in the Kupyansk direction, where we have the Oskil River that goes to the border, you can see that Surat maps showing quite a few changes here, although Andrew Perpetua is showing none, and that might tell you something. Probably quite dynamic. Russians making some claims that they have got across the Oskil River and are attacking around a place called Kamianka and Krasnopershia. Here, the Russians may have done that, maybe taking some land, and possibly even taking back or trying to take back Hrafivka, which is a village that the Ukrainians took back recently. Now it looks like, according to Surat maps, which is generally in line with what the MOD are saying, the Russians could be pushing back there. But then the Ukrainians themselves pushing the Russians back around Vorichina, which is interesting, and around Zapadny quite a lot. Although this looks more in line with what the claims were a week ago. Like I was claiming this a week ago, and we are seeing, bear in mind this might have happened a week ago, as in this mapping update is 7 days in the making. So this might have been at the back end of that week that Surat maps agreed that the Russians had been pushed back around Zapadny and Vorichina. We have here, but actually interestingly, this is coming out from yesterday, further pushes from the Ukrainians around Zapadny. The Ukrainians advance west of Zapadny, and you can see just getting over the other side of that road there. Let's go down and have a look here. So that's the Zapadny road, so that is that they are in control of this area, meaning there's probably going to be a grey zone before you get to the town itself. So the Ukrainians possibly putting some pressure on the Russians in Zapadny. We have a claim from Grayskull again that the Russians were forced to withdraw south of Sienkiewka. So we have that settlement there. The grey zone looking like it's going right into Sienkiewka now, with some area to the south being cleared by the Ukrainians. So that's coming back over to here. And Surat maps agreeing that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back here, but they're not agreeing that some of Sienkiewka is a grey zone, as according to Grayskull. So here you would have a grey zone, and the Ukrainians in control of this area to the south. So definitely some pushback into Kupyansk area. It's one of the sort of better places for Ukraine at the moment. Then we come down to, I think we're coming to, Nadia next. Okay, so let us go back to the map. Here we have a bit of Ukrainian gain around Kostiantynopil-Andriivka. Those are sort of glitches there. So a little pushback maybe for the Ukrainians north of the Pistchani area. But when we come south of the Pistchani area, okay, we get to Vishneve, Stepi, Nadia there. So Nadia was this village that the Russians took a long time to take. Then there was some pushback there, and then it was fairly stable until this larger sector saw the Russians get to the Oskil River. But if you remember, this was the area around Ryarodka that the Ukrainians were pushed back from. The Russians pushed over the Zherebets River, and this was kind of, I think, the first time they pushed over the Zherebets River, and then made a run towards Borova, which is right over here by the Oskil River. And everyone's like, "Oh no, you're not going to get that far." And then the Ukrainians stopped the Russians and actually pushed them back a little bit. But there was a lot of fighting around here. This took up quite a bit of my mapping updates at the time. It was here. Hrafivka was a place that we heard mentioned a whole number of times. Where are you? Hrafivka, there it is. Hrafivka, that the control of that seems to be disputed. We have Andrew Perpetua saying it's grey zone, Surat Map saying it's under Russian control. But if you remember, Hrafivka and Nadia and these places definitely were under the microscope for some time. The Russians expended quite a lot of effort in taking that land there. It all came rather more easily the further on we went, and it was all about Kursk taking resources away, and etc. etc. Now what we're seeing today, like the last 24 hours, Russians are reporting that Ukrainians have advanced in the Vishneve and Nadia areas. And that, so Nadia there, Vishneve up over here. That's really good news for the Ukrainians. And there's actually quite a bit of footage. I can't show you any more of that because I think there are dead bodies and whatnot in this. But Ukrainian Defense Forces regained control over Nadia settlement in the Luhansk region. It's a third separate assault brigade, so these guys are really good fighters, one of the crack units. While Russians were capturing Nadia, they destroyed 2 of their mechanized regiments and spent 2 months on that. It is back under Ukrainian control. So this is quite a big difference here. So the big news, the 3rd Azov Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has liberated the settlement of Nadia in the Luhansk region, which the Russian forces have been trying to capture for 2 months and ultimately cost them the destruction of 2 mechanized regiments, and the Ukrainians captured it in 30 hours. Which is, okay, that's a way that the Ukrainians are going to play this. Brigade reclaimed 3 square kilometers of territory, had earlier taken the Russian forces 2 months to capture. But it's not a lot. And you've got to remember that the Ukrainian successes at the moment are pretty insignificant compared to what the Russians have achieved over the last, I would say, 6 months plus, right? And so these grinding successes, I mean, if you go down to the south here, around Vorichina, so remember we were just reporting forever and a day about Mariinka and Vuhledar, right? So these are back here. That entire area now is under Russian control, and they are moving forward. So these sorts of areas are relatively small in comparison, and that bears remembering. But it's really good to see blue pins from my point of view, and it's good to see them in multiple areas. So they're pushing back in Kupyansk area, in this, I don't know what, I keep calling it the Pistchani sector. And then, of course, we've seen in Torsk, but there are lots of purple pins, as you can see as well. Okay, when we come down to the Torsk-Uturni area, we can see a few pins just designating a couple of fields taken by the Russians in that area. We're going to come further down to the south and see that there could be some further gains in the kind of general Vokhnokamianska, Belgorod area, but there's a big difference, a huge difference between the mappers here. And that interpretation, I think, is entirely significant, because if the Russians really did have control of particularly this area up here, as Surat Map says, then Seversk is in serious trouble. Now, the Russians are definitely pressuring there, and they have had some successes, but you've got some very interesting topography around here. The relief of these mountains and the chalk mine pit, if you like, quarry, and all sorts here, provides good defensive capabilities for the Ukrainians. Losing that would be huge. You've got the river as well that comes along there that's very difficult to get across. And that's a really significant area, and I'd be interested to see what underwrites the huge difference between the mappers, both up there and then further down the Seversk front on the way down towards Bakhmut further down here. We can see around Bakhmut no massive changes around Chasiv Yar, although, like, very disturbingly for the Ukrainians, there is one area that Surat Map and therefore the Russian MOD are claiming that they have control over, and that's fairly significant, as in it's an urban area, part of Chasiv Yar, but generally fairly stable. Further to the north around Hrafivka, northwest of Demodovka, on the way to Orekiv and Ukrainian, the Russians are making some gains, again, according to Surat Maps only. And then further gains, according to Surat Maps, around Torsk. Now, this is interesting because there are claims that the Russians are counterattacking there. There were some rumours we're hearing previously of Russians using better troops around here, better trained troops. Some Ukrainians were saying that, but yeah, some potentially it could be that the Ukrainians, although they've had some success and they're pushing the Russians back, they had been pushing the Russians back fairly consistently. That might have slowed down a bit, or this could be sort of rejigging. It's quite dynamic. So unsure really what's going on in Toretsk. If we look at the latest from a pro-Russian mapper, here we have Ukrainian armed forces advancing in the city centre of Toretsk there. So let's try and put that on the map. That's around here. So that's there. If you see, you've got, let's go back there. Yeah, you've got two tailings heaps there, either side of the road. And then just to the right of there below the other one. So that's around here. That's this kind of area that they've taken back. Well, actually, we've already got that on. Well, that would be grey zone. So this is the Russian control line, isn't it? And so you'd have grey zone around here and the Ukrainians maybe on the outskirts. This is indicating that actually the Ukrainians are pushing back, and the grey zone goes right back here towards, let's see, there. The grey zone is actually right back to here. So that would be very different to what both mappers say, but certainly what Surrey Maps says. Well, no, actually both mappers, because they have the Russian defensive line all up around there. So it could be that whole area is now sort of grey zone, and that would be good for the Ukrainians if that is the case. This map is a lot better for the Ukrainians than this one, I would have thought. Okay, so coming out of there, fairly dynamic, as I say. We come along to the Prokrovsk area, where there could be some gains for the Novobakhmativka. I remember talking about that ages ago. Right, could be some small gains for the Russians there, but nothing too significant to get worried about. Same up there near on the way to the T0504. Well, actually, this is interesting. So this is Tarasivka. Around Zeleny Pole, and there are claims that the Ukrainians are actually gaining around here at Tarasivka. So that goes against what some other mappers are saying. In fact, here it is. So in the Prokrovsk sector, it is being reported that Ukrainian forces have captured Tarasivka and are pushing back the Russians from the southern outskirts and clearing it. And that came from yesterday. So that is really quite a recent one where the Ukrainians are in control of that area. Whereas here we have Surrey Map saying the Russians are pushing up there. So that could be the opposite to what is actually going on there. And then remember, some gains go into grey zones, and so it won't show up unless there's a movement in the Russian defensive line, as according to either of these mappers, there will be no pins on this map. So if the Ukrainians could be making gains all over the shop, they're not, but in principle they could, by just going into the grey zone but not shifting the Russians back, but just taking control of more of that kind of no man's land, but it wouldn't show up on the map. So it's worth remembering that, though. And then when we come across to the Prokrovsk front, you can see that actually, forget that one, that's not going to be too relevant. There are, in fact, this is, well, actually this is quite important. So this is Surat Map saying that Shevchenko is now fully under Russian control. They've taken that back, and yet we had heard so much about how the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back in Shevchenko and pushed to the south of Shevchenko. Now, I'm not hearing anything about that in particular at the moment. We are hearing that in this direction, the Ukrainians are taking some area around Malyshev-Baki. Let's try and get a sense of where Malyshev-Baki is. I've forgotten. Let me pause for a second. Of course, that's back at the junction. That's that junction on the T0504 highway. This is something we've seen a number of times. This area here, basically, that seems to go, well, backwards and forwards maybe. Well, it's happened at least once. The Russians have attacked. Then they were beaten back, actually, and then they took control of it. And then they've been beaten back there. And I don't know how recent this is, because I wasn't aware that the Russians had made claims to being still in control of that. But anyway, there is that. Then I was just talking previously, obviously, about Shevchenko here, and how it's interesting that Surat Maps has that under control now of the Russians, whereas other mappers somewhat disagree. Pro-Ukrainian channel reports that Ukrainians have advanced south of Shevchenko, although that is now 5 days ago. So that's what that's my caveat, is that these are fairly they can be fairly dynamic areas where, in a single day you can have each side, taking and then losing and then retaking certain areas. So who knows what's happening there, but that would be a shame if the Russians are pushing back in that area. And then we are come on down to, this is going back to the 16th though, so I don't know even that's worth really repeating. Mixed news there, talking about positives here and negatives going on further down to the south. So as we come further towards the south, we can see that the Russians are making some gains around the Zaporizhia village. We've seen that previously, and then quite a lot of land here, this kind of open land that connects the Andriivka, Kostiantynopil area up to the Kursk sector. They're just sort of filling it in, equalizing that front. So there are no kind of pockets of Ukrainian resistance that you wouldn't want to be Ukrainian stuck in there anyway. But yeah, some gains right around here. Gains to the north of, I was going to say to the north of, it's not there, Ulakli there. I just lost my, it is, Kostiantynopil, around Andriivka. The Russians, according to Andrew Perpetua, are closing in and taking land in that pocket there, but still a huge difference between the two mappers. You can see the orange lines of Surat maps much further to the west than Andrew Perpetua's blue lines, denoting Russian defensive areas. But the Ukrainians possibly attacking back around Andriivka and around Kostiantynopil. So actually, if you go back to Tim White here, it actually is useful to show this. So 7 days ago, Kostiantynopil may be lost shortly. Russian troops are in the centre. I understand the next updates will be crucial. Well, actually, you're seeing possible counterattacks there, to the point where this source, Ostatvishnya, says Ukrainian advancement in Kostiantynopil and Andriivka. So that would be good news for the Ukrainians there. So that one is in the former, and then that one in the latter there. So really good news if the Ukrainians are pushing back there, and they could be further to the west. Further to the east, and is indicated by my mapping synthesis, where we have an area taken there, which would be round about here, and then looking north of there. In this map, it does come out a bit here, but not nearly as pronounced as Surat Maps has it. So some pushback there for the Ukrainians, and that's the first time we've seen blue pins in this area, I think, to that kind of degree. But unfortunately, the further to the south you go and along towards the kind of Velika Novosilka area, the Russians are still making those incremental gains that are cumulatively, quite important. They are taking more and more of this land, and certainly a challenge. Then as we come out of there, we get confirmation that the Russians have been pushing in Zaporizhia. There's been talk about sort of cutting the road to Orekiv here. Some small gains more directly to the south or southeast of Orekiv, but around here, the Ukrainians interestingly were pushing at Kamianka. They were pushing just to the west of Zherebianki, and now the Russians seem to be, really going for it, going for Malyshev-Baki. That was an area that we heard that the Russians were really intent on taking, and it looks like they are having a go at that, to the point where no report says, according to Stanislav Osman Bunyatov, a platoon commander of the 24th Separate Assault Battalion Ida, Russian forces have increased their activity in the Zaporizhia region in a number of settlements. Previously, geolocated footage showed Russian presence in Shibaki, which is what we're just talking about. There's Malyshev-Baki and that kind of area. So they are, making those advances, the Russians. That was on the 17th, so that's a good 6 days ago. So keep an eye on that one. That looks like a new area where the Russians are pushing. Now, interesting that there is quite a lot of activity along the Dnipro River, and there's quite a lot of activity from the Ukrainian Air Force dropping these, particularly these French guided glide bombs, the Hammer bombs, the ASSM bombs. We have some significant strikes around Novokhovka and around Dnipryani. So Dnipryani is around the Krinky area, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I've gone to this neck of the woods. We have Novokakovka up there, and yeah, Dnipryani there. So that area is seeing some attention with these guided glide bombs, and that's just up from Krinky, which is itself just up from Kherson, and the Antonivsky Bridge area. We saw the Konka Bridge that was taken out there by the Ukrainians as it crossed the Konka, just there. It's already been destroyed. The actual Antonivsky Bridge has been destroyed. But yeah, there seems to be a focus. I know GMT Politico on my threads this morning was saying that there's been an uptick in activity, and there are rumours that it could portend to a Ukrainian attack across there, but I doubt that. We've seen a Russian attack or a building up of activity around here previously, and there were rumours about Russians wanting to attack across there. I don't know. I wouldn't speak to either claim. I think it would be fairly suicidal to mount, unless you've got huge forces, to mount significant cross river attacks. On March the 21st, the Air Force struck and destroyed a combined company of crossing support of the 205th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade in Dnipryani, Kherson region. The strike destroyed enemy watercraft, naval assets, and a utility room filled with technical assets, is the claim here. French Aid to Ukraine says the Ukrainian Air Force carried out an airstrike with French-supplied AASM Hammer 250 bombs. Quote, this strike destroyed enemy watercraft, naval assets, and a utility room full of technical assets, as we heard. Yeah, crippling their ability to fight in the area, says War translated rather optimistically. Yeah, activity there. Does that represent anything other than just striking key targets for the Russians in the area to stop the Russians themselves attacking across the river? Probably more likely. But I do get a sense that the Ukrainian Air Force are using their guided glide bombs more frequently than they previously were. I don't know if that represents those French bombs being more numerous in the Ukrainian stocks, or any situation with regard to a degradation of Russian air defenses that means that they can operate more freely near to the front line. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know that, but we can but speculate. But of course, the Russians are keeping up their relentless use of their own guided glide bombs, although there are talks afoot that they are struggling more with the jamming that the Ukrainians have in place for those guided glide bombs, which is great news for the Ukrainians, of course. Right, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of use. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.